So these are just some of the books that I referenced for this whole thing to happen. These are 4 of probably like, I would say 10 sources that I actually read on this. And so that being said, these are all ideas that are basically not mine for the most part. And that's a good thing. You don't want to hear me, you want to hear legitimate people who have doctorate degrees and not just a bachelor's degree in 1 or 2 classes in this. And so I want you guys to keep that in mind as well as we move through this content, because some of it is from atheists, some of it's from people who have different points of view than me. And so I wanted to present you with kind of the whole spectrum of that. So if that sounds good, we're going to move into it right now with understanding and reconciling the violence of God in the Old Testament. So we're going to, that's not great. There we go. All right. So what do we mean by divine violence? What's like kind of the definition that we're going to work with? It's divine violence is essentially the term used to describe biblical passages in which God either condones, commands, or enacts violence upon creation. So that's kind of what we're working with here, is that definition of there are biblical passages where it seems like God condones, commands, or he enacts violence upon creation. So that's what we're going to work with for this whole crash course. And so some of those examples are the flood. That's very clearly like God bringing water and flooding the earth, killing a whole bunch of people except for Noah and his family. Sodom and Gomorrah, which is, him bringing columns of fire down, destroying 2 cities except for Lot and his family. Abraham and Isaac, where it's the sacrifice part, that's why it says the sacrifice part there. Abraham and Isaac are father, son, and God one day just shows up and goes, "Hey, Abraham, go and sacrifice Isaac for me, like sacrifice him to me." And so Abraham gets up, goes to do that, and he almost does, and then God provides him a goat or a ram to sacrifice instead. And then probably most egregious is the Canaanite genocide, which is all these different tribes in the promised land of Israel. And there are passages where God explicitly kind of says like, hey, go and wipe these people out, not just like the men, not just the soldiers, but like women, children, even livestock. And so the ones in red are going to be the ones that we're going to cover. And I'm not going to do these things justice, basically. We have 2 hours in this, and these are going to be, I could do a crash course on each and every one of these. And so this is going to be 40,000 foot level, just like blow right over it, give you a whole bunch of basic information, just an overview of the whole thing. And I'll just try to do the best I can in that. So just be aware that that's with that in mind, basically. This isn't just like a full, in-depth study of each and every one. We just don't have time or space to really do that, unfortunately. But I'll do the best that I can with what I've got. So that being said, we're going to keep moving. The problem is God normally is presented to us in a couple of different ways. This is where like the discrepancy kind of gets happens for us really a lot, is like God is presented to us in terms of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life. That's usually the God that's presented to us. God loves us. God's, happy. He's up in the sky. He's this like big bearded dude. He's kind of like Santa a little bit, He's just chilling, having a good day. In addition to that, we have Psalm 145:9, which says, the Lord is good to all, and his mercies are all over. It's blocked. I don't know. I can't read it. There's like camera on this side. And so, yeah. But basically, and then you have Psalm 86, for you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive and abundant in loving kindness to all who call upon you. And so that's another verse where he's like, very much emphasizing that God, you are good. You're ready to forgive us. You're abundant in loving kindness. Anybody who calls upon you is going to be totally fine. It's going to be rose petals and bushes and everything. These are kind of the images that we have of God, right? And then ultimately we have James 1:17, which says, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And I underline that part because there is no variation or shifting shadow. That's basically saying there's no discrepancy. There's no contradiction in God. There's not a time where God is essentially bipolar or hiding himself from us in any way. It's just we can know God. We can know his character in the word, and we can know his character based on the things that he's done. And so that seems kind of funny then, because if you look at these ideas of genocide, if you look at these ideas of killing people, it seems like that's a very different God. And we break it up very, very crudely with like saying that it's the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God, where the Old Testament God is just angry all the time, mad, very passionate. And then you have the New Testament God who is mainly Jesus, mainly the Holy Spirit, you know, all good, all love and peace and kindness and everything all the time, basically. And so, but this passage in James is basically saying there's no variation in him. There, whoever the Old Testament God is the same as the New Testament God and vice versa. So we have to reconcile those two things together. And so we have other examples even in the pop culture world of worship songs. Basically, the worship songs that we sing on a Sunday morning are very much so emphasizing more often than not the goodness of God, the lovingness of God. And one of the perfect examples is What a Beautiful Name from Hillsong, which is got this verse that says, "You didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down. My sin was great, your love was greater. What could separate us now?" And so these are kind of the ideas that we're working with, right? These are just the pop culture references, the church references of who God is. And so culture has created that is focused on the positive attributes of God, often in either intentionally ignoring or sometimes we forget about the attributes and characteristics that are more difficult to understand about God, which is all those things that I talked about in the Old Testament. And so we now have a quote from Richard Dawkins where it kind of ushers in like the severity of what I'm talking about with this. And this is a guy who's an atheist. He's a professor. He's very, very well known in academia. He speaks out against Christians a lot. He says this about God: "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, I think, genocidal," he said a bunch of other big words that I couldn't pronounce, "malevolent bully." And so this is the idea that we're working with then, that we're trying to refute, is this idea of who the God of the Old Testament is. And so clearly Richard Dawkins is pointing to an idea that is hard to kind of refute. It's hard to kind of defend God in the Old Testament in light of these things. And so that's what we're going to try to be doing a little bit more. We have a quote from Daniel Hawk, who wrote one of the books that I read for this. He's the author of The Violence of the Biblical God. We have to account for a loving God who saves by killing Egyptians in one part of the Bible and by being killed by Romans in another. And so we have these two dichotomies in God that we have to reconcile together. And so how do we solve this problem then? How do we go about solving this issue of these two personalities of God, if you will? And so typically you'll see one of these 5 different approaches to interpreting these instances of divine violence. Whenever I say DV, it's divine violence. The first one is to just straight up deny it. And so we'll go into these in depth, but the first one is to deny. The second one is to look at the other guy and say, basically, these people weren't as bad as the other people in the time. The third one is to say that they were super bad guys. Like whoever was the victim, they were super, super bad guys. Like you got to understand, they were really, really bad. And then the fourth is to look to history. And ultimately the fifth is just to say that's not canon. Like we're just going to, throw that part of the Bible away. And so the first method of denying, this is a pretty common belief amongst Christians, actually. This is, they don't really know how to like explain it. They don't know how to justify it or look into it, investigate it. And so it's a pretty common belief to just deny that this is part of the Bible. The idea is to deny that these violent passages were even God's intent. And usually you point the finger at man and say, he either misheard or misinterpreted what God wanted him to do. And so an example of this is, when Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, he misheard God. He was going to accidentally kill Isaac, and that's why God stopped him. And so that sounds pretty good initially, but the problem with it is there's lots of explicit times where God either commands people or does the action himself. And so that's the huge problem that we have to reconcile is, there's not a lot of times where God says, you misheard, hold on, no, I meant this instead. And people are going, oh, my bad, kind of thing. Sorry, I was about to kill a bunch of people. And also there's no rebuke after actions take place. Like there's no times really where God says, you guys didn't get me here. It's like he commands, they do the action, and then that's pretty much it. That's the conclusion of it. And so the second is to look at the other guys, basically. The second is to look and say, well, the other ancient kingdoms compared to Israel, were like this. You know, the Assyrians were notoriously brutal in warfare. Babylonians were barbaric. They were super bad. And so they had all these different instances of rape, child sacrifice, murder of innocent civilians, all that kind of stuff. They were really, really bad people. And so the idea is to compare that to Israel and say, like, well, Israel is doing these things, but not nearly on the scale that the other kingdoms are doing these things. And so that's the kind of idea. But the problem is it's still violence. It's basically saying, you know, officer was going 90 and he was going 100. Like you're still in the wrong. Basically, it may not be as egregious of a wrong, but you're still in the wrong. You're still going over the speed limit. And so the third is any victims that were a victim of divine violence in some way or a decree from God, they were really, really bad. This is kind of along the lines of that second idea. And many scholars and theologians will actually take this point of view. I've read this a bunch where a lot of people just won't question God and will just say, like, hey, these people were really bad. They probably deserved it, quite honestly. And so this is actually kind of on the right track. This viewpoint is actually kind of on the right track. It attempts to display the severity of sin in comparison to the holiness of God. That's a really important point, I think, is the severity of sin. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later in comparison to the holiness of God. And so seeing that discrepancy, seeing how severe that gap is between us and him is a really, really big point of this whole thing. But the problem is this is attributed too much in the Old Testament, or it's attributed to too much. It's kind of like a seasoning that you put on way too many things. It's like ketchup, you know, where it's good with fries, it's good with a burger, but it's not good with ice cream. You know, that's kind of what this viewpoint is. It might be attributed to one or two stories in the Old Testament, but it's not appropriate for all of them, basically. So some would say, like, that Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac because of some unseen sin that Isaac committed. That's not really a very valid viewpoint at the end of the day. It's just kind of like thrown out there to kind of justify those actions, and it's not really delving into the actual issue at hand. So the fourth is to look at history. This is the historical approach. It's attempting to show that the Bible is written in a very specific context and culture. And just like the last one, this is actually like a pretty, you're on the right track kind of thing. Like if you believe this, you're at least trying to show that violence was part of this time and that violence was a part of a different time. But this is where it kind of starts to get a little more suspicious, is when people say violence is a part of a less evolved time. And so one pro is to look into the ancient Near East, like I said, that looks for answers, looks at their culture for answers. But the problem is it gives away to progressive revelation. And so this idea of progressive revelation is basically this. It's this view that God met the Israelites and their forebears at the level of their understanding and progressively revealed truths that lifted Israel to a higher and truer version of themselves and human dignity. And so this comes from Daniel Hawk as well, from The Violence of the Biblical God. This is the idea where it's kind of like growing up a little bit, where when you have a parent that knows all of these things and they're developing their kid, you don't tell a toddler how to drive. And so as they grow up, you progressively reveal different things about the world to them. As they're ready for it, you reveal. As they grow, you reveal it to them. And it sounds pretty good, right? It sounds kind of like we can relate to that. That's our own development as human beings. But the problem really is that that's not really how God works with his people at the end of the day. That's not really how this divine violence problem is reconciled. And also it discredits early believers and people by implying that they were too simple to understand God like a modern person. I really think that that's kind of a big problem of this, is it's kind of lessening their view. It's lessening who they are as people and kind of like putting us on a pedestal because like we have cars and, you know, modern day stuff and everything. And so my view is that we should flip that. We should try and learn from them, not the other way around. Like this shouldn't be this us looking down on them. It should really be like us looking up to them and seeing like, what are the things that we're missing here? And so if we flip that, that's really a great place to be. And so then the final one that I didn't put in here that I completely forgot about when I was making the slideshow was the idea that it's not in the canon. And so when you come to a story that's like Sodom and Gomorrah, that's like all these different things, that's just not a part of the Bible. And so we're just going to cut that part out. And that goes well for about 5 minutes until you realize, like, no, these parts are actually very intentionally in the Bible. Like, scripture is very intentionally set up to be informing one another, to be supported by each other, to be, all this like kind of like airtight, really like valid piece of literature. And so that's kind of where we're sitting with that. Any questions so far? This is a good natural point to kind of like stop and take questions, anything like that. How are we doing? Again, I can only see 4 of you, so if you can unmute. This is not super ideal, I get it, but it's all good. So, okay, if there's no questions right now, I'll just keep going. I think that that's all pretty straightforward stuff for the most part. Just kind of like all the different ways that we try to go through these things. And so with that in mind, we're going to come to the first problem, which comes to us from Genesis 18 and 19, which is the problem of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I really like artwork that kind of like depicts different biblical motifs, including like the very violent artwork. And so like this is a picture of basically like Lot and his family fleeing the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah as they're being destroyed by God. Columns of fire are raining down on them. It's this crazy scene and everything. The idea with this is like the problem that we have here is like these are cities being destroyed by God. There's no in-between person that's not like a Samson situation where Samson is wiping out all these unrighteous people and he's the good guy fighting the bad guys or anything like that. This is God very clearly acting in creation and he's destroying these cities. And so what are we supposed to do with that? How are we supposed to reconcile this story? How are we supposed to look at this image and go, yeah, that's the God that I follow. Yeah, that's the God that I'm comfortable with putting my faith and trust in. And so that's what we're going to be working with right now. So the key information that we'll see hopefully from this story is that Sodom and Gomorrah aren't just peaceful cities. That's kind of like a big misnomer. That's a big, that's something that people like get wrong, I think, a lot, is like, they're not just peaceful cities. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Abraham intercedes on their behalf, actually. That's in Genesis 18. We'll learn about that in a minute. And then there are a lot of parallels in the story of the flood narrative. For most of you, you probably know like this idea of like the flood where like Noah is commanded to build an ark and he and his family are the only people who are saved as like the flood comes and everything. And that wipes out all the bad people in the world. And so that's kind of what we're working with here with that. And so this is very, very similar, as we'll see, to the flood narrative. So just kind of going through like these stories, we're not going to read these 2 chapters. We'll be here all night if we like read every single instance, but I'll give you kind of like the highlights in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from Genesis 18 and 19. And they're this. So this is from Genesis 18. You start in verse 2 where it says, 3 men appear before Abraham, God and 2 other people. They're not identified, but you can kind of tell that they're angels. And so these 3 men appear to Abraham one day. He's just chilling, hanging out, and they appear. Abraham prepares a meal for them. As a side note, here is when God promises once again that Sarah will have Abraham's son. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. The 2 men then head to Sodom. So Abraham's camped outside of Sodom. These 2 men start heading over, and God announces that he has heard outcry against the 2 cities and heard of their sins. And so that's in verse 20 and 21. He talks about these people are really, really bad. I'm going to go send these 2 people, investigate, figure it out kind of thing. He already knows, but he still wants to send these 2 angels to go and figure it out. And the interesting thing is Abraham intercedes for any righteous person in the city. And so this part is actually worth reading. This is like a very, very important part of the story. And so I'll read that. It starts in verse 22. It basically says, so the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? And so he knows what God is about to do. He knows that God is about to wipe these 2 cities off the face of the planet, basically wipe them away from existence because they're just so bad. And he's saying, wait, hold on. He's basically saying what any of us would think. He's like, hold on. What if there's like good people in there? Like, why are you going to get rid of everybody if like there are some good people? Like, you don't want good people to perish, right? And God says, no, yeah, you're right. I don't. If I find any at Sodom, the 50 righteous, I will spare the whole place. He says, I'll spare him if there's 50 righteous people. And God knows that there's not 50 righteous people because these two men are still walking towards Sodom. He can call it off at any time. And he says, no, yeah, you're right. I would spare it if there were 50 righteous people. And these men are still walking. So that means there's not even 50. And so then Abraham goes, hold on. Okay. Okay, hold on. So maybe 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. This is in verse 28. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? He said, I will not destroy the city if I find 45 people. If 45 people are righteous, I won't destroy these cities. And these two men are still walking. And so then Abraham basically goes down the list and he says, well, what about 25? And God says, yeah, you're right. I won't destroy these cities for 25 men. And these men are still walking towards Sodom. I won't destroy for 15. I won't destroy for 10. And so it's meant to show you that there's not even 10 righteous people in these cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's nobody in there that is righteous at all. There's nobody worth saving. It has to be cleansed in some way. And so that's kind of the evil that we're seeing on display here in these two cities. And so that's just like an interesting point to read, I think. So then we continue in chapter 19. The two angels enter Sodom and they're taken to the house of Lot. This is where God is like actually saving just one family. This is like supposed to be the only righteous family in all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they're the only people that are worth saving, basically. And so then we see in verse 4 through 7, all of the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and they demand that they give them the two men. I'll try to keep it PG for right now. That verse is kind of showing the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. Basically, that's kind of like showing like these men really aren't safe. There's like violence happening in the city. These people really are messed up in a lot of different ways, really, really sinful. And so Lot is trying to plead them and beg them to go away. In verse 7, the angels blind the crowd actually, and they tell Lot to take any loved ones and family out of the city before they destroy it. So they're clearly saying like, hey, get out. You got to clear house. We're about to destroy this place. And then Lot is brought out of the city to flee, and God and the angels destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that's kind of the idea of these two stories, or these two chapters, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. These are just completely hopeless people. They're unrighteous in every way. When you have one little like instance of them, like you see, like you're exposed as a reader to them for just like a couple of verses, and you can see that they're really, really bad. They're really, really wicked. They just want to be sinful all the time. And so they've made their choices in the eyes of God. And so that's what they're going with. And so some takeaways from this, one family was spared, Lot's family. And so as Abraham's interceding for them, God's saying, you're right, I won't destroy any of the righteous people. I won't kill anybody who in this city who is righteous. And so the fact is that he sent two angels in there first to get these people out and spare them. So Lot's family is spared. This is parallel to the flood narrative in the same way, where if there was a single righteous person in the flood, then that person would be spared, and that person was Noah and his family. And so they were spared as well. And so that's why there's parallels in this story to the flood narrative of like, God is bringing destruction, but he's bringing destruction in terms of cleansing. He's bringing destruction to cleanse these people. And so there's the parallels of unrighteous groups. There's a parallel of God rescuing one righteous man and his family, like we talked about, and there's the cleansing of sinful man. And so that's what we got there. This quote from Augustine might be a little, I read it sometimes and I don't understand it, but then I kind of come back and I'm like, okay, cool, it's fine. Basically what this quote is saying is this. Basically, evil and sin are allowed to exist in order to have the best possible world where free beings follow God and do good. These good deeds, when compared to the atrocities of sin and evil, display the severe lack of good that is found in a sinful person. And so applying that then to this story, looking at this story, then we see the severe lack of good in Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're given like a scale of what's good and what's bad, you're meant to see that Sodom and Gomorrah are just the baddest of the bad, basically, and that Lot and his family are good. And so you're set up with this dichotomy from the very beginning. So that's kind of that. Sorry, I'm kind of running through that one really quickly. I wanted to kind of get to this one and then hopefully the problem of genocide in a minute here. Does anybody have any questions so far? Cool, no problem. That's totally fine. You guys doing okay? Everybody doing all right? Sweet. Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And so if we look at this picture, we have, very clearly you have the ram in the background that's like going to be provided for Abraham. And it's like Abraham's in like full like swing about to kill his son. His son's like helpless there, really, really young. And, oh my gosh, I'm about to die and everything. The angel's like coming in at the very last minute, about to get him. It's depicted in this way a lot. And if you look up just art and if you look up all these different stories, like people view this story as this picture right here. It's just very much so like in the nick of time, like God got him, in the nick of time, like this angel came in and like, stopped this from happening and everything. And so what this initially tells us is like God's playing with creation. God is wanting, manipulating, Abraham and Isaac. This is really unfair for him to sacrifice his son and everything. And, it's really messed up to like call it off at the very last minute. Like, what is God doing here? Is he like bipolar or something like that? He goes to sleep and wakes up and he's like, I'm gonna kill Isaac, and then I'm not. And it's kind of like back and forth. It seems very inconsistent, right? And so hopefully we'll try to work through the story and see like none of those things are really true, that this is actually incredibly intentional, and this picture actually doesn't depict it or do it justice really at all. And so moving then to Abraham and Isaac, the idea here, we want to set up some background first. And so God enters into a promise and a covenant with Abraham from Genesis 12 through 15. And so these chapters are like kind of the key to understanding the relationship between the two, the relationship between God and Abraham. For those of you who may not be around church a lot, this guy Abraham is kind of like picked very early on as like God's guy, basically. Like he's like the guy for God. He's, if God had a baseball team or something like that, this would be like the star player, like Abraham. And so as a result, God enters into this promise and the covenant with Abraham, and he makes all these promises to Abraham. He says, first of all, I will make a name for you. That was a huge thing. There's a huge theme in the Old Testament of like, I will make a name for you. This is basically to say like, I will make your name known. And that's a very, very good thing. That's a huge blessing that basically nobody deserves. And then all of a sudden he brings it to Abraham and says, you deserve that. I'll make a name for you. The second one, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. That's a huge, huge blessing. There's a whole line of like thousands of years of like the blessing for people being kids, the blessing being a lineage, and starting the lineage is like a huge part of that. And so basically he's saying your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. I'm going to make you the most blessed person that I possibly could. Your legacy is going to be great. And then finally, I will give your offspring this land. So Abraham is settled in this land at this point in chapter 15. I will give your offspring this land. That's a very, very huge part. And so God is giving him a name. He's making him famous. He's giving him a legacy, which is also a huge blessing, and he's giving him land. This is like 3 for 3 Old Testament. If you're following a God in the Old Testament, like times, this is 3 for 3 out of the park. Your God is the best God out of all of them. You're going to be famous. You're going to have a lot of stuff, basically. And so Abraham must be over the moon at this point. And so to emphasize that even more, in Genesis 15, Abraham splits animals in half and God walks through them. And so this was a very, very Old Testament way of confirming these like different deals. And so if you wanted to go and do a deal with somebody and they split a calf or something in half, if they split an animal in half, you were to walk through it. And the idea being, if you ever didn't hold your end of the promise up, if you didn't ever uphold your part of the covenant, you were going to be basically saying, let it be done to me what was done to this animal. Like, let me be split in half, just like this animal was split in half. It was a very intentional, a very serious, a very unwavering commitment to a person. And so for God to do that, for God to walk through split animals was a huge, huge promise to Abraham. And so the final promise is that Isaac will be the start of these blessings, and it can only be through him. God is very, very intentional about saying that. He even says it, he even goes out of his way to say it in chapter 18. When we were reading about that earlier, he was saying like, this is very, very intentionally going to come through Isaac. And in fact, you're going to have Isaac through Sarah, who was like 90 years old, all this stuff and everything. So that brings us to this point now where Abraham has Isaac. he knows that all these blessings are coming. He knows that all this is going to happen, and he knows that Isaac is going to be the start of that. And so then we come to Genesis 22, where God says basically in the first verse, I'm going to test you, go and sacrifice Isaac. Go and take the only son that you have, your only son that I love, and go and sacrifice it. And so two things to note right out of the gate. The audience knows from the phrase God tested Abraham that this is from the very beginning, there was never intention to kill Isaac. Us as readers, this is cluing us into a literary device that this is actually never going to happen. This is actually a test from the very beginning. And so as readers, it's never like a tension of like whether or not like Isaac is going to die. The tension is always going to be with whether or not Abraham actually does it. And so whether or not Abraham actually goes through with this. And so this doesn't really completely justify the story, but it's kind of a start. It's the idea of like, this is kind of a start to like go down that line a little bit. You know, this is the beginning building blocks of like this whole story. The second thing to note, Leviticus 1:3-13 describes how to offer a burnt sacrifice to God. In case you're desperately wanting to know how to offer a burnt sacrifice to God, there's your place to go right there. Leviticus 1:3-13. That details it out and everything. And one of the key parts of that, kill the sacrifice before placing it on the altar. That is a key part of that verse. And so what does Abraham do? Abraham places Isaac on the altar alive. That's a key. If you were an Old Testament person, if you were an ancient person reading the story and you saw Abraham placing Isaac on the altar alive, you would know, wait, hold on. He's doing it wrong. Like there's something up with this story. There's something wrong going here. Like going on here. He shouldn't do that. And so this could also show that he knows this is a test as well. And so he's kind of like waiting to ultimately sacrifice Isaac at the end of the day. And so, or it's like the 11th hour, I should say. And so it could show that he knows that this is a test. But we have other evidence to kind of show that as well. And so if we continue, the key for this story, it must be read in the context of the Pentateuch. And the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in case you don't know. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's considered the Pentateuch. And so if we look at the Pentateuch, we look at Leviticus 18, verse 21, and 20, verses 1-5, and then Deuteronomy 12-31 in chapter 18:10. These verses strictly prohibit child sacrifice. They're very much so against it. They're very much so saying, like, don't do this. This is bad. There's 4 different places. If something is repeated 3 times in the Bible, it's extremely significant. If it's repeated 4 times, that's even more explicitly like, don't do this or do this. So this is like very much so, do not do this. Do not sacrifice children. This was kind of like in a response to idolatrous Canaanite practices. Canaanites were like a tribe, basically like a group of people. They were basically, you know, this was law speaking out against what they were doing in their practices. And so more on that later. That's like further on down the line for us. But the idea here is like, if Abraham were to go through this, he would be in direct violation of Levitical law. He would be in direct violation of Old Testament law if he did this. And so that's an important piece to this. But the most important part, though, is Abraham's silence. We noted in chapter 18 that he, you know, when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, he's like interceding. He's like, hold on, wait, don't. These people are righteous though, like don't kill them, you know, like if there's somebody righteous, like save them, please save them. And so it's kind of curious that he doesn't even question or speak. He literally in the verse in chapter 22, when God says, hey, go and sacrifice your only son Isaac, he doesn't even speak. He literally just gets up and he goes off to sacrifice his son. And so the vocal protest is such a disparity of his character, like that just 4 chapters before. And so to a lot of people, to a lot of interpreters, this shows that he is fully aware of God's character in both chapters. And he shows that God will provide since Isaac is seen as righteous. And so he knows that his own son is righteous. He knows that the blessings are coming through him. And so when God says this, to do this, to sacrifice him, he doesn't even question it. He goes for it because he knows that he's being tested. And so finally, we come to Isaac himself. The idea is often that Isaac is this like really young kid. He's like 4 or 5 years old. He's, you know, walking with his dad. He's just this innocent kid. And so actually, when we look at it, the word that describes often, or Isaac, that is often translated young man more than child. So it's a Hebrew word. I don't know Hebrew, and so I can't pronounce it for you, but it's this Hebrew word that means, more often than not, it means young man rather than child. Josephus, who was an early church person, he places Isaac at approximately 25 years old when this happens. That was the source that I got from a book as well that I read. And so the question also that he poses to Abraham in verse 7 shows that he is aware that of sacrificial ritual. And so, like, this whole picture that we see of Isaac as well is of this guy, basically, who is very aware of what's happening, very aware of the law, very aware of like how sacrifices are meant to be carried out. And so then in verse 7 he goes, "Hey Dad, where's the animal that we're going to sacrifice?" He is old enough to be aware of those happenings. He's old enough to be aware of what the ritual is supposed to look like. And Abraham says, like, the Lord's going to provide for us. Like, don't worry, the Lord's got us, basically. And he doesn't question any further. And so if we look at that evidence, if we look at him being older, if we look at him knowing how this is done, if we look at all of that and everything, we are given more of a picture of this. And so instead of Isaac being this like young 4 or 5 year old kid, he looks more like this. I kind of look like him actually, but like he looks older, and he is older than anybody that could have really anticipated. And so we have this picture then of Isaac kind of like willingly going along with it as well, being tested as much as Abraham is being tested, willingly going and walking as much as Abraham is walking. And so some of the conclusions for this, readers and probably Abraham know from the start that this is just a test and not an actual command to kill Isaac. Abraham obeys without question, both against his character displayed in Genesis 18. This is directly against that, and in opposition to Jewish laws concerning sacrifice. So those are two big things that he would like be going against. Basically, it wouldn't be like him, and it wouldn't be like the rest of the Bible. It wouldn't be like the rest of the law. There's clear allusions and foreshadowing to God and Jesus, with God knowing fully that Jesus would resurrect, and Jesus knowing fully the sacrifice that must be made. So Abraham is like God, and Isaac is essentially like Jesus in this. So they know fully well that what's going to happen is going to happen. And then God provides in both stories and blesses for faithfulness, basically. And so in this story, it isn't necessarily this 11th hour as he's about to come down with the knife on Isaac. He's given this ram and like, hold on and everything. It's more of a, all right, you passed the test. Here's the actual sacrifice. I'm going to provide for you. Let this be known that this is going to be like a part of the covenant, basically. And so this isn't an instance of God being, bipolar. This isn't just like God waking up one day and going, oh my gosh, I want you to kill Isaac. Oh wait, never mind, kind of thing. It's very intentional from the start. It's very intentionally laid out for him, and it's a test, and it's meant to be blessing Abraham further, because he knows that he's not going to go through with it. So that's the idea that we have for that. That's the idea that we have for Abraham and Isaac. Do we have any questions? All right, no problem. This now is going to be, so if you guys see the time a little bit, we're at 6:46 right now. We've got about 15 minutes left. And I'll probably stay on afterwards and answer any of the questions that you have as well. This problem right here, this genocide problem, is going to be the rest of Crash Course. This is going to be the rest of the 15 minutes, and this is going to be the rest of the hour next week. So we're going to be just in this problem of genocide. Some of the passages that I'm talking about are going to be Joshua 21 and 1 Samuel. Both of those areas are areas of the Bible that God is literally saying to people, hey, go to this city and basically lay waste to everybody, man, woman, child, livestock, pets, like everybody. It says leave the trees, which is kind of a weird one. Like, why would you leave trees? But okay. And so this is going to be probably the most egregious problem in divine violence. This is what most people will point to as being like a huge problem. Atheists love this problem when they like go and try to like criticize the Bible. This is a huge issue for Christians, and so that's what we're going to spend the bulk of our time in. We wanted to kind of like give you like a whole overview, so it's not just like a genocide crash course. It's going to be like more than just that, more robust and built out. So that's why we did Sodom and Gomorrah. That's why we did Abraham and Isaac. But this is going to be kind of the meat of the entire thing. And so the question that we want to answer kind of like for the rest of the day is, what are the steps that we need to go through in order to understand this problem? What are some of the things that we as Christians need to understand as we come to this issue, with all those methods in mind, with like denying, with, you know, saying that it didn't happen, with like, oh, it's all historical and everything? Those don't really seem quite right. What are the steps that we need to go through in order to understand this problem at hand? And so I'm glad that you asked, because these are some of the things that we would all generally agree on. Most Christians would agree on these things. And so the first one is that God is good and compassionate. We see that, as we talked about before, in anything from like our worship songs to different things that we read about God, to sermons that we hear. Just everything kind of points to this idea that God is good and compassionate. The second thing, the Old Testament is a faithful record of God's dealings with humanity. We were always told that God has, you know, put this Bible in our hands. That's his word for us. The whole thing is his word for us, including the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's a faithful record of God's dealings with humanity. The third thing, the Old Testament describes events that are identified as genocide. I just said two of them right off the top of my head: 1 Samuel and Joshua 21. Those are instances where it looks like, and it seems like, God is actually commanding genocide, and there is genocide taking place. And then the fourth one is that genocide is always evil. And so that's going to be the four things that we all kind of like generally agree with. I would think that if you presented these to anybody on the street that is a Christian, they would say all four of these things: yes, 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 basically. The problem, though, is that these four things can't stand together. Given the evidence of genocide in the Old Testament, all four of these things can't stand together. There's a lot of discrepancy between them. And the main idea is that if you look at that fourth one, you look at genocide is always evil, and you go, okay, but there's genocide in the Bible. What's happening there? There's discrepancy there. You can't reconcile all of those things together. Even from a logical standpoint, from a moral standpoint, we can't look at that and say, oh, I believe in a God who is loving and good, but also kills over here. I can't necessarily do that. That's hard for me to do. And so that's where the problem arises, essentially. And so what one is forced to do is one of four things, and this will be kind of set up for the next week. So just bear with me with this a little bit. We have to reevaluate in some way. We either have to reevaluate God, our perception of God. We either have to reevaluate the Old Testament, our perception of it, what we think of it and everything. We either have to reevaluate the interpretation of the Old Testament, or we reevaluate genocide in the Old Testament. And so that's what we're going to be doing today, is going through these four things really quickly, and just what would happen if we reevaluated God? What would happen if we reevaluated the Old Testament, and so on and so forth? And so I actually don't have any slides for this one, but I'll just read these basically based on the notes that I have, if that's okay with you guys. Basically, the first one, the idea of reevaluating God. Atheists would recommend we do this. That's kind of the main crux of that one. Atheists would highly, highly, highly recommend that we do this one, reevaluate God. And more often than not, people who want to hold to this one, they'll say that genocide is always evil. They'll look at that fourth one and say that genocide is always evil, and that's the most important and unwavering point out of all four. And so they'll often reject the Old Testament. They'll often reject all interpretations of the Old Testament. They'll just say, no, these depict genocide. Genocide is always evil, therefore something's wrong here, and it's more often than not, it's God. And so these arguments for that quickly devolve into taking any slight instance of violence against man as genocide, and they condemn God's character as a result. This would essentially mean that we reject God, and therefore Crash Course is over 9 minutes early. And so we're not really going to buy into that one. That one's just kind of like the most improbable one, basically. So basically what it is that violence is there, but God is also good. God is also good and compassionate to us. We know that from our personal experience. We know that from sermons and everything. Those aren't incongruent. And that's not where the problem is. If we go look to the second one, if we reevaluate the Old Testament, scholars will look at this one, and it often looks like rejecting parts of the Bible altogether. This goes back to the different methods employed to interpret these passages. This was the fifth one, where like, oh, that's not canon, let's just get it out of the Bible. It gets really messy really fast. for us to like want to like accept the whole Bible as is. Remember how I said like the whole Bible is pretty much like it's meant to inform one another. Like, you know, Genesis informs Revelation, and Mark informs Amos, and Amos does, you know, justifies this, and you know, it bounces off of each other, works together in tandem. It's really, 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 it's like a closed loop in that sense. It all works together really, really well. And so if you start cutting parts of that out, if you start cutting parts of the machine out, the machine is just going to fall apart really, really quickly. And one huge problem in that, the Old Testament does not contain accounts of God rebuking his people or for misinterpreting his words. And so we have to take this as like, this is what God meant. This is what he was going for. And the actions that they carry out match what he commanded. And so this is a tough one for Christians, especially, but a lot of scholars will look to that one and say, we need to reevaluate our Old Testament. This third one's fun. I like this one. This one gets pretty funny pretty quick in time. Reevaluating the interpretations of the Old Testament. We can say that this is legitimately a step in the right direction. This is an attempt to understand the ancient context in which it came from. Remember how we talked earlier about the different approaches. This is like the historical approach a little bit, but making it spiritual. And so the different interpretations of the Old Testament would be different things. And so one of my favorite ones is one that gets really spiritual really quickly. It's from this guy named John Cassian. He looks at the 7 Canaanite nations. There's 7 Canaanite nations that are to be destroyed by Israel. He looks at them as 7 vices that we must conquer within ourselves. And so he doesn't even look at them as historical like accounts or anything like that. He doesn't look at them as actual tribes. He looks at them and goes, hey guys, almost like a motivational speaker, like, hey guys, you need to conquer this in your life. You know, you need to conquer your lust. You need to conquer your sin in this way. You need to conquer your pride. And there's a tribe for pride and everything. And so you need to be like the Israelites and get in there and conquer it. And that just feels like it overly spiritualizes these things. You know, it has no regard for the historical accounts of this. It has no regard for anything like that. And by doing this, one is denying that these events were a part of history even. And you're setting yourself up for another set of problems by rejecting that history, basically. You're basically just like not even looking at that. And that's what most people who refute this will look at. Another problem with this is inconsistencies and having a lot of like possible readings come together. A prime example of this is a guy named Richard Hess. He's actually a theologian that I respect a lot. I love this guy. Listened to lectures from him. He came to Biola a couple of times. He has a lot of really good interpretations, but when it comes to Joshua 21, which is Jericho, he's got a couple of interesting ways of like understanding and interpreting this passage. And so just to read you kind of a couple of examples that he would say are part of this story. He says the word for city could also potentially mean fort. So he's saying that Jericho could potentially be a fort. There's a part in the story where Rahab, who runs like a brothel house in the middle of Jericho, in the Jericho center, is like saved. Her family is saved. He says, oh, it could have potentially only been the civilians in that city then. So he's like trying to show it's like potentially a military encampment. The phrase men and women, young and old, which is like a phrase that's very common. We'll talk about that next week. That's meant to like kind of describe everybody. He's saying like the phrase men and women, young and old could potentially be just a synonym for saying everyone. And then the word for king could potentially be referring to a military general. So he's kind of like, if I'm sure you like, if you're sitting there right now, the through line that you're hearing from me is like a lot of potentially. Like a lot of these things are like, that's a lot of potential. And usually the rule with biblical stuff like that, it's a lot of hoops to jump through. And the more complicated something gets, the less probable it ends up being. And so Richard Hess is very well respected. That's the actual viewpoint. I can even point you to the lecture that he did on that. A lot of people believe that. A lot of people stand by his work and everything. It is just a little bit abstract and a little bit more out of the box, I guess you could say. There's other ways to kind of get to answering this problem than that way. He's basically saying like it was just military on military, no civilians were involved. He's on the right track, but he's not really quite there just yet. And so where we're going to leave it for this week is the fourth one then. We have to reevaluate genocide, or our view of genocide in the Old Testament. What do we really mean by that? how are we really going to go through that and everything? And so that's where we're going to leave it. I'm going to pray real quick. Thank you so much, guys, for hanging in with me. I hope you guys did at least. Like I said, I only see 3 of you, so sorry about that. But thanks so much for hanging in with me. I hope it was informative, you know, maybe not entertaining, but informative. So let me pray real quick. Dear Lord, God, thank you so much for students who want to learn, God. Thank you so much for just their willingness to come out on just a regular old Tuesday night in the middle of their summer. They could be doing a million different things right now. Thank you for letting them have this time to learn about you, God, in just a different way. And I pray that I gave them just a little bit of a different perspective or some answers to maybe questions that they've been having. And I just pray, God, that this starts conversations in our community, in our impact groups that will be fruitful and will be glorifying to you, God. And we love you so much. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks,
All
Matt.
righty, guys. Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for hanging in with me.
Yeah, I recorded that. We'll throw that up on the YouTube